Exhausted after 72 hours of intense work, all she wanted was to relax in the first-class seat she'd legitimately paid for. But when a racist flight attendant tried to humiliate her and remove her from the flight, one simple gesture changed everything. What no one knew, this was just the beginning of a case that would unravel secrets no one saw coming. Zara Mitchell's shoulders ached as she navigated through JFK's Terminal 8. 72 hours of non-stop surveillance, tactical planning, and, finally, the arrest of a domestic terrorism cell had left the 35-year-old FBI special agent bone-tired. But there was satisfaction beneath the exhaustion. The operation had been a success, with 0 casualties and 5 suspects now in federal custody. She'd earned this. After 3 days subsisting on vending machine coffee and protein bars, sleeping in 4-hour bursts on a cot at the field office, Zara had made an impulsive decision at the airport. When the booking system offered her an upgrade to first class on her flight back to Atlanta, she didn't hesitate. It was a small reward, a moment of luxury after the grueling operation. Just once, she would treat herself to those wide leather seats and attentive service instead of being wedged between strangers in economy. In her well-worn jeans, simple navy t-shirt, and casual blazer, Zara looked like any other passenger. Her curly black hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the only makeup on her deep brown skin was a touch of tinted moisturizer and mascara. Nothing about her appearance screamed federal agent, which was exactly how she preferred it. The badge and Glock 19 service weapon were securely tucked away in her nondescript leather messenger bag, along with her FBI credentials. 15 years in the Bureau had taught her the value of blending in. As she stood in the priority boarding line, ticket in hand, Zara's thoughts were already drifting to her apartment in Atlanta. A long, hot shower, her own bed. Maybe she'd even splurge on delivery from that Ethiopian place around the corner before crashing for 12 straight hours. "First-class passengers and our premium members may now board," announced the gate agent. Zara stepped forward, boarding pass ready. 3 more hours, and she'd be home. The thought brought a small smile to her face as she handed her ticket to the agent, who nodded politely. "Enjoy your flight, Ms. Mitchell." Walking down the jet bridge, Zara felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. This was the start of her well-earned downtime. Karen Williams adjusted her perfectly pressed Navy uniform in the crew lavatory mirror. 20 years with American Airlines had taught her exactly how to maintain the company's exacting standards. Hair secured in a tight bun with not a strand out of place. Makeup subtle but flawless. Uniform wrinkle-free. Gold wings pin gleaming above her left breast pocket. She applied another coat of the airline's mandatory red lipstick and smiled at her reflection, satisfied. At 48, Karen considered herself the gold standard of what a flight attendant should be. She'd started flying when service still meant something in the airline industry, before companies began cutting corners and letting just anyone into first class with points and miles. 2 minutes until boarding, Karen, called her colleague Lisa through the door. Coming, Karen replied, giving herself one final assessment before exiting the lavatory. The other flight attendants were already at their stations. Michael, the purser for today's flight, was organizing the welcome champagne for first class. Lisa was checking the economy cabin, and young Tyler, barely 6 months into the job, was stocking the galleys. "I'll handle first class," Karen announced, taking the tray of champagne flutes from Michael. "You know how particular those passengers can be." Michael raised an eyebrow but didn't protest. Everyone knew Karen insisted on first-class service. She called it her specialty. What her colleagues recognized, but rarely mentioned, was Karen's unofficial passenger hierarchy. Her high standards masked carefully calibrated treatment based on what she deemed a passenger's status. The senior flight attendant had a knack for identifying those she considered real first class versus those who didn't belong. Somehow, the latter often included passengers of color, though Karen would vehemently deny any racial bias if confronted. Remember, she often told new hires, first class is about creating an exclusive experience. Not everyone understands the etiquette. As boarding began, Karen positioned herself at the entrance to the first-class cabin, welcoming each passenger with a practiced smile that reached her eyes only for certain travelers. She mentally cataloged each person who passed, Businessman, proper first class. Older white couple, definitely regular first class. Asian tech executive, acceptable. Middle-aged white woman, perfect. Then she saw Zara Mitchell step into the cabin, and Karen's smile tightened imperceptibly. Her eyes flicked to Zara's casual clothing, then to her boarding pass. Something was certainly out of place. The Boeing 777-300ER gleamed under the harsh airport lights, its recently renovated first-class cabin a testament to American Airlines' latest luxury push. 12 spacious pod-style seats were arranged in a 1-2-to-1 configuration, each featuring hand-stitched leather upholstery in a rich navy blue. Privacy dividers, personal entertainment systems with 24-inch screens, and side tables of polished walnut created an atmosphere of exclusive sophistication. The cabin had been redesigned just 3 months ago, a fact Karen mentioned to favored passengers with pride. "Our most premium experience," she would say, emphasizing the word premium as if it were a secret password to an exclusive club. As Zara settled into seat 3A, a window position on the left side of the aircraft, she took in her surroundings with quiet appreciation. The cabin was already half full with its typical demographic, predominantly white male executives in designer suits, tapping importantly on laptops or murmuring into phones. 2 Asian businessmen conversed quietly in the center section. An elderly white couple sat in 1D and 1G, the husband already flipping through the wine list. The ambient sounds created a specific atmosphere. The soft click of laptop keys, the gentle chime of notifications, hushed conversations about market shares and quarterly reports. This was a space of privilege, a microcosm of America's upper echelons where a seat could cost as much as a monthly mortgage payment. A digital display near the galley showed the current time and countdown to departure, 30 minutes remaining before the scheduled 2:15 p.m. takeoff. The artificial time pressure created a subtle undercurrent of tension as flight attendants moved with practiced efficiency to complete pre-departure services. Through the window, Zara could see luggage handlers loading the final bags into the aircraft's belly. Beyond them, planes taxied on the tarmac against the backdrop of New York's distant skyline. A moment of stillness before the journey home. Karen glided through the first-class cabin with practiced grace, a bottle of Dom Perignon in one hand and crystal flutes in the other. "Welcome aboard champagne," she offered with a warm smile to the silver-haired man in 1A, who accepted with a nod. She continued methodically, serving the elderly couple, the businessmen in their tailored suits, and the tech executives who barely looked up from their devices. Zara watched as Karen worked her way through the cabin. When the flight attendant reached the row just before hers, Zara set aside her phone, anticipating her turn. But after serving the passenger in 2C, Karen pivoted smoothly and returned to the galley without acknowledging Zara's presence. For a moment, Zara wondered if she'd missed something. Perhaps there wasn't enough champagne for everyone. But when Karen emerged again with fresh napkins for passengers who already had drinks, the oversight became unmistakable. Zara raised her hand slightly as Karen passed. "Excuse me, could I get some champagne as well?" Karen's smile didn't waver, but something in her eyes cooled. "Of course, in a moment. I'm attending to priority passengers right now." She continued toward the front of the cabin without elaboration on what made others priority over Zara. The comment landed like a paper cut, small but unexpectedly sharp. Zara lowered her hand, feeling the eyes of nearby passengers briefly flicker toward her before returning to their own business. The businessman across the aisle, who had received his champagne immediately, gave her a quick glance of curiosity. Zara took a deep breath and returned to her phone. After 15 years in the FBI, she'd developed a refined radar for microaggressions. This wasn't her first encounter with subtle discrimination, and she'd learned to choose her battles carefully. A missed pre-flight beverage wasn't worth creating a scene. Still, as she watched Karen fuss over a late-arriving white passenger in the front row, ensuring he received champagne immediately, the message was clear. Some passengers were more welcome in first class than others. 20 minutes before departure, the cabin hummed with pre-flight activity. Flight attendants checked seatbelts, stowed carry-ons, and distributed hot towels to almost everyone. Zara noticed the pattern continuing. When snack preferences were collected, Karen somehow missed her row. When additional pillows were offered, Zara's request went temporarily forgotten. None of the slights were overt enough to justify a formal complaint, yet they formed an unmistakable pattern of exclusion. While responding to a work email, Zara became aware of someone watching her. In seat 2B, diagonally across from her, an elderly white man with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes had been observing the interactions. Unlike the other passengers who seemed oblivious to Karen's behavior, this man's gaze was sharp and evaluative. When their eyes met, he offered a small, knowing nod before returning to his book, a thick legal volume with tabbed pages. "Just a few more minutes before we close the doors," Karen announced to the cabin, her tone warm and professional. She paused by the elderly man's seat. "Can I get you anything else before takeoff, Dr. Stevens?" The man, Dr. Stevens, shook his head. "No thank you, Karen, though I believe the lady behind me hasn't received any of the pre-flight services." His voice was measured and carried the weight of authority, though he spoke softly. Karen's smile tightened imperceptibly. "I'll see to her right away, sir." As Karen walked away, Dr. Stevens turned slightly in his seat. "I apologize for overstepping," he said quietly to Zara. "But I've been observing a discrepancy in service that seems rather pointed." "Thank you, but it's fine," Zara replied diplomatically. Years of training had taught her to diffuse rather than escalate situations when possible. "I'm just looking forward to getting home." Dr. Stevens studied her for a moment, then nodded respectfully. "Of course." Karen returned with a lukewarm towel for Zara, dropping it on her tray table rather than presenting it with the two-handed courtesy she'd shown other passengers. "Here you are," she said coolly. "Anything else you need?" The question felt like a challenge rather than an offer of service. Before Zara could respond, Karen had already turned away, addressing another passenger with renewed warmth. Dr. Stevens' frown deepened as he observed the exchange, the furrows in his forehead telling a story of recognition and disapproval. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be closing the doors in approximately 10 minutes, announced the captain over the intercom. "Flight attendants, prepare for cross-check." The first-class cabin had settled into pre-departure routines. Laptops were being stowed, final phone calls made, seat positions adjusted. Zara had just finished sending a text to her team leader confirming her arrival time in Atlanta when Karen appeared at her side. "Excuse me," Karen said, her voice clear enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Are you certain this is your seat? First class is typically reserved for our executive customers." The cabin didn't fall silent, but there was a noticeable dip in conversation volume as several passengers glanced toward the interaction. Zara looked up, maintaining her composure despite the thinly veiled implication. "Yes, this is my seat 3A, as indicated on my boarding pass," Zara replied evenly, retrieving the document from her pocket and holding it up. Karen made no move to take or examine the boarding pass. "It's just that we've had incidents of passengers moving to first class after boarding. I'm sure you understand our need to verify." "I understand the need for verification," Zara said, her voice remaining professional though her patience was wearing thin. "Which is why I presented my boarding pass at the gate and again when I entered the aircraft. Both times it was confirmed that this is indeed my assigned seat." Karen's smile remained fixed. "Sometimes mistakes happen at the gate. Our first-class experience is designed for passengers who are accustomed to a certain level of service." The implication hung in the air between them. Several passengers were now watching openly, some with uncomfortable expressions, others with simple curiosity. "I assure you," Zara said, "I am in the correct seat. I purchased a first-class ticket, and I'm entitled to sit here just like any other passenger." Dr. Stevens shifted in his seat, turning to witness the exchange more directly. His expression had hardened from concerned observation to evident disapproval. Karen's posture stiffened slightly. "Of course, I'll just need to verify your boarding pass again to ensure everything is in order. Company policy." A policy, Zara noticed, that seemed to apply exclusively to her. Maintaining her dignity, she once again extended her boarding pass. "Here you are." Karen took Zara's boarding pass between two fingers as if handling something distasteful. She made a show of examining it meticulously, turning it over and holding it up to the light in a theatrical display of verification that she hadn't performed for any other passenger. Karen said, her voice loud enough to carry throughout the first-class cabin. I'll need to check this against our manifest. There may have been an error in the system. By now, most of the passengers in first class were watching the interaction. A young Asian man in seat 4C had subtly positioned his phone on his tray table, its camera lens pointing toward the confrontation. Is there a problem? Zara asked calmly, though she felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach, the same tension she experienced whenever her legitimacy was questioned in spaces where people who looked like her were scarce. It's just unusual, Karen replied with exaggerated patience. Our first-class passengers typically check in online or through our premium counter, and they're usually— She glanced pointedly at Zara's casual clothing, letting the unfinished statement hang in the air. A flight attendant from economy, Lisa, passed through on her way to the galley and paused, sensing the tension. Everything okay here, Karen? Just verifying a passenger's seating assignment, Karen replied. I'll handle it. Lisa glanced at Zara with a brief, apologetic smile before continuing to the galley. Karen continued examining the boarding pass, turning it over unnecessarily multiple times. This seat, 3A. It's one of our premium locations. The system sometimes makes errors with seat assignments. The system made no error, Zara stated firmly. I specifically selected this seat when I purchased my ticket. Purchased? Karen's eyebrows rose slightly. Not an upgrade using miles or a companion ticket? The question had a specific undertone that wasn't lost on Zara or on several of the passengers witnessing the exchange. It carried an implicit assumption. People like you don't pay for first class. I purchased this ticket with my own money, Zara replied, each word precise and measured, as I have every right to do. Dr. Stevens' knuckles had whitened around his book. Nearby, a middle-aged woman exchanged an uncomfortable glance with her husband. The cabin had grown uncomfortably quiet, with only the ambient sounds of the aircraft's preparation for departure filling the silence. Karen finally returned the boarding pass, placing it on Zara's tray table rather than handing it to her directly. Well, everything seems to be in order, technically speaking, she said, her tone suggesting the opposite. Thank you, Zara replied, tucking the boarding pass back into her pocket. Karen didn't move away. Instead, she leaned slightly closer, lowering her voice to a stage whisper that was still perfectly audible to nearby passengers. This ticket— it appears to be an automatic upgrade from the system. Did you actually pay the full first-class fare, or did you receive some sort of promotional upgrade? The question was a calculated trap. If Zara admitted to any kind of upgrade or discount, even one legitimately available to all travelers, Karen would have her justification for the different treatment. If Zara insisted she paid full price, she would appear defensive, as if trying to prove her worth. I paid for first class, Zara stated simply, refusing to engage with the false dichotomy. As I mentioned before, and as my boarding pass confirms. It's just that our regular first-class passengers typically have certain expectations about their travel experience, Karen continued. We try to maintain a consistent environment for them. Zara met Karen's gaze directly. I'm sure all passengers in first class expect professional service without prejudice. That's certainly my expectation. The word prejudice hung in the air between them. Karen's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. I'm simply doing my job, ma'am. Making sure everyone is where they belong. Where they belong. The phrase carried centuries of historical weight that Karen either didn't recognize or deliberately chose to ignore. Dr. Stevens closed his book with an audible snap. His gaze, when it landed on Karen, contained a sharpness that belied his elderly appearance. He didn't speak, but his silent disapproval was palpable. Karen straightened, momentarily thrown off by Dr. Stevens' evident displeasure. Well, if you need anything else before takeoff, just press your call button, she said to Zara, her voice suddenly brisk and professional. As Karen walked away, Zara noticed several passengers exchanging glances. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed oblivious, and a few wore expressions of dawning recognition about what they had just witnessed. The young man with the phone was still recording discreetly. Zara took a deep breath and centered herself. She had faced worse confrontations in her FBI career. This was unpleasant, but manageable. The captain's voice came over the intercom again. "Flight attendants, prepare for departure in approximately 5 minutes." Karen disappeared into the galley but emerged moments later with Michael, the chief flight attendant, a tall man with salt-and-pepper hair and a professional demeanor. They spoke in hushed tones at the front of the cabin, Karen gesturing subtly toward Zara's seat as she whispered urgently. Michael's expression remained neutral, though his eyes flickered briefly toward Zara with an appraising look. Together, they approached Zara's seat. Michael took the lead, his demeanor polite but cautious. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Michael, the chief flight attendant on this flight. Is everything all right here?" Before Zara could respond, Karen interjected. "We have a situation with a passenger who may be in the wrong seat," she explained, her voice carrying a hint of authority. "I've checked her boarding pass, but there may still be an irregularity." Zara kept her expression neutral. "There's no irregularity. I have a valid first-class ticket for seat 3A, which I've shown twice now." Michael nodded, clearly trying to be diplomatic. "I'm sure everything is in order, but she doesn't match our typical passenger profile for first class," Karen interrupted, dropping any pretense of subtlety. "And, given her appearance, I thought it best to double-check." A few audible gasps came from nearby passengers. Dr. Stevens half rose from his seat, but then seemed to reconsider, watching the scene unfold with intense focus. Michael looked uncomfortable. "Karen, I'm not sure that's—" "It's our responsibility to ensure the comfort of all our premium passengers," Karen continued, gesturing vaguely toward the other first-class travelers. "Some of our regulars expect a certain environment." The implication was crystal clear, and, judging by the expressions on several passengers' faces, it wasn't lost on them either. The young man in 4C was still recording, though he pretended to be adjusting his seat settings. "Are you suggesting," Zara asked calmly, "that my presence in first class would make other passengers uncomfortable? Based on what criteria exactly?" The question hung in the air, direct and unavoidable. Karen's smile became brittle. "I'm simply following protocol for passenger verification." "Is it protocol to question only certain passengers about their right to be in first class?" Zara pressed, her voice still even. "Because I've been observing since boarding, and I appear to be the only one subjected to this level of verification." Michael's discomfort was visible now. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I apologize for any inconvenience. I'm sure there's just been a misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Karen cut in, her professional veneer slipping slightly. "I'm doing my job, ensuring everyone is in their proper place." The words "proper place" echoed in the cabin, laden with historical connotation that silenced several conversations. Even passengers who had been pretending not to listen were now watching openly. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had grown tense. Other flight attendants moved through their pre-departure routines with heightened awareness of the confrontation unfolding in row 3. The aircraft doors had been closed, and the ground crew was preparing for pushback. Any delay now would affect the flight's departure time. Karen squared her shoulders, emboldened by what she perceived as Michael's tacit support. "If you cannot provide additional verification that you actually paid for this first-class seat, we'll need to ask you to move to economy." There it was, the ultimatum, delivered with the confidence of someone who had never faced consequences for this type of behavior. Zara remained outwardly calm, though her pulse had quickened. She had dealt with high-pressure situations involving armed suspects, but this kind of public humiliation triggered a different kind of stress response, one familiar to many who had experienced racial profiling. "I've shown you my boarding pass twice," Zara stated. "I've confirmed that I purchased this ticket. What additional verification could you possibly require that hasn't been asked of any other passenger?" The young Asian man in 4C had abandoned any pretense of discretion. His phone was now openly positioned to record the confrontation, its red recording light visible. Several other passengers had shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some looking away in embarrassment, others watching with undisguised interest. "Perhaps a loyalty program card?" Karen suggested. Our regular first-class passengers typically have executive platinum or invitation-only status. Ikou, so only regular first-class passengers belong here? And who determines what a regular first-class passenger looks like? Zara asked, her voice steady but pointed. Karen's eyes narrowed slightly. That's not what I meant. I think it's exactly what you meant, Zara replied. Michael looked increasingly uncomfortable, caught between company protocol and the obviously problematic situation unfolding before him. Perhaps we should— The flight is fully boarded now, Karen interrupted. If we need to make seating adjustments, it should happen immediately before we depart. She turned to Zara. So, unless you can provide additional verification, I'll need to escort you to an economy seat. A murmur ran through the cabin. Dr. Stevens had removed his reading glasses and was watching the scene with undisguised disapproval. Zara took a deep breath. She had hoped to avoid escalation, to handle this quietly and professionally. But it was clear that Karen had no intention of backing down, and the situation had already become a public spectacle. I would like to speak with the captain, Zara said firmly, making direct eye contact with Michael rather than Karen. Karen scoffed slightly. The captain is preparing for takeoff. He doesn't have time for seating disputes. Nevertheless, Zara insisted, I would like to speak with him before I'm forced to move from the seat I rightfully purchased. From the corner of her eye, Zara could see the young man still recording. Nearby, a woman whispered something to her husband, who shook his head in apparent disbelief at the unfolding scene. Michael hesitated, then nodded. I'll see if the captain is available. The approach of Captain James Peterson was heralded by curious glances from passengers in the aisle seats. A commanding figure in his crisp uniform, complete with 4 gold stripes on each shoulder, he moved through the cabin with the calm authority of someone used to managing crises at 35,000 feet. We're now running approximately 10 minutes behind schedule, he announced, coming to stand beside Michael. His expression was professionally neutral, but the slight tension around his eyes indicated awareness that the situation was delicate. Karen immediately stepped forward. Captain, we have a passenger who's causing a delay by insisting on remaining in first class. I've tried to resolve the situation quietly, but she's being uncooperative. The framing was masterful in its distortion, transforming Karen's discriminatory behavior into a narrative about an unruly passenger disrupting the flight schedule. Several passengers who hadn't witnessed the earlier interactions shifted their gazes toward Zara with newfound suspicion. I see, Captain Peterson said, his voice measured. He turned to Zara. Ma'am, what seems to be the issue? Before Zara could respond, Karen continued. She claims to have purchased a first-class ticket, but doesn't have proper verification. Given the circumstances and our departure time, I suggested she move to economy, where we have available seating. The circumstances, Zara noted calmly, being that I am the only passenger in first class who has been repeatedly questioned about my right to be here, despite presenting a valid boarding pass twice. The captain's gaze moved between Karen and Zara, assessing the situation. Behind him, the cabin door remained closed, and the jetway had already been retracted. Every minute of delay now affected the airline's on-time performance metrics and potentially disrupted passengers' connections. Dr. Stevens cleared his throat. Captain, if I may, we'll sort this out quickly, Captain Peterson said, cutting off the older man's intervention. He turned back to Zara, his expression professional but with a hint of impatience. Ma'am, could I see your boarding pass, please? The request, coming after Zara had already presented her documentation multiple times, underscored how effectively Karen had controlled the narrative. Nevertheless, Zara reached for her boarding pass once more, her movements deliberate and dignified. Captain Peterson examined Zara's boarding pass with professional efficiency. Unlike Karen's theatrical inspection, his review was quick and matter-of-fact. This appears to be in order, he confirmed, returning the document to Zara. But instead of concluding the matter there, he continued. However, I'm concerned about the delay we're experiencing. My first responsibility is to ensure this aircraft departs safely and on schedule. The implication was clear. Resolving the dispute quickly took precedence over addressing the underlying issue. Ma'am, The captain continued, his tone reasonable but firm. "We can resolve this quickly if you cooperate with the cabin crew's instructions. Once we're airborne, we can discuss the situation further if necessary." Karen stood slightly behind the captain, her expression carefully neutral, though Zara caught the flicker of triumph in her eyes. Several passengers were now checking their watches or phones, their frustration at the delay becoming evident. "With all due respect, Captain," Zara replied evenly, "I have cooperated fully. I've shown my boarding pass multiple times, confirmed I purchased this ticket, and remained calm despite being singled out. The only reason we're delayed is because your flight attendant has decided I don't belong in this seat based on criteria she hasn't applied to any other passenger." A tense silence followed her statement. The captain's expression remained impassive, but he glanced briefly at Karen, who immediately adopted a look of professional concern. "Captain, perhaps it would be best if—" Karen began. "Excuse me," interrupted Dr. Stevens, rising from his seat. "I feel I must speak up. I've been observing this situation since boarding began, and this young woman has been subjected to discriminatory treatment that no other passenger has experienced." Karen's composure slipped momentarily. "That's completely untrue. I've been following standard procedures I've flown over 2 million miles with this airline," Dr. Stevens continued firmly. "I know the procedures, and what I've witnessed today falls well outside them." Captain Peterson's expression tightened as he recognized the situation was more complex than initially presented. Other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The young man with the phone continued recording. "We've already delayed departure," the captain said, his tone indicating his displeasure with the situation. "We need to resolve this now." He turned to Zara, his expression stern but not unkind. "Ma'am, I understand your frustration, but my priority must be getting this aircraft off the ground. Can we find a compromise here?" The question placed the burden of resolution squarely on Zara's shoulders, asking her to be the one to yield despite being the wronged party. It was a familiar dynamic, one she had encountered throughout her life and career. Zara looked around the cabin. Eyes were on her from every direction, some sympathetic, others irritated, most simply curious about how this drama would resolve. Karen stood with barely concealed satisfaction, certain that the pressure of delaying an entire aircraft would force Zara to concede. For a moment, Zara considered simply accepting the injustice. It wouldn't be the first time she'd swallowed her pride in the face of discrimination. She could move to economy, file a complaint later, avoid the spectacle. It would be easier. But then she thought about the next person who would face this treatment, and the one after that. The endless chain of small injustices that went unchallenged because challenging them was exhausting and often costly. Zara took a deep breath. "I didn't want to do this," she said quietly, "but you're not leaving me much choice." She reached for her leather messenger bag stored under the seat in front of her. Every movement was deliberate as she unzipped the main compartment and removed a small leather wallet. The cabin fell silent, all eyes fixed on her hands as she opened the wallet to reveal a gold badge gleaming under the cabin lights. "FBI Special Agent Zara Mitchell, Counterterrorism Division," she stated, her voice clear and authoritative. "I'm returning from an operation in New York, and yes, I paid for my first-class ticket as I am entitled to do." The revelation landed like a thunderclap in the cabin. Karen's face drained of color, her confident posture crumpling as she stared at the badge. Captain Peterson's professional facade cracked momentarily, revealing genuine surprise. Zara continued, her voice steady. "I've been patient with what is clearly discriminatory treatment. I've provided my boarding pass multiple times, confirmed my purchase, and remained calm throughout this ordeal. At no point have I been treated with the same respect or given the same benefit of the doubt as the other passengers in this cabin." She closed the badge wallet but kept it visible in her hand. "I had hoped to resolve this quietly and professionally, but that option was repeatedly denied to me." The young man with the phone was still recording, his eyes wide with the unexpected turn of events. Dr. Stevens had a small, satisfied smile on his face. "I don't want special treatment," Zara concluded. "I simply want the same respect afforded to every other passenger who purchased a ticket in this cabin. Now, shall we continue this discussion, or can we proceed with our flight? The question hung in the air. The power dynamic in the cabin irrevocably shifted. Karen stood frozen in place, her expression a mixture of shock and dawning horror as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. Captain Peterson cleared his throat, his demeanor noticeably changed. "Agent Mitchell, Special Agent Mitchell," Zara corrected gently but firmly. "Special Agent Mitchell," the captain amended. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. Agent Johnson, I sincerely apologize for this inconvenience," Captain Peterson said, his tone completely transformed. Gone was the stern authority figure pressuring her to comply. In his place stood a man suddenly acutely aware of the potential consequences of the situation. "If I had known—" "Special Agent Mitchell," Zara corrected again. "And the issue isn't that you didn't know my profession. The issue is that your flight attendant decided I didn't belong in first class based solely on my appearance, and you were prepared to support that decision without questioning its basis." Karen had gone completely pale, her earlier confidence replaced by visible panic. She took a half-step back as if physical distance might somehow protect her from the consequences of her actions. I was just following procedure," she stammered, the excuse sounding hollow even to her own ears. "Which procedure specifically?" Zara asked calmly. "The one that instructs you to serve champagne to every first-class passenger except me? Or perhaps the procedure that tells you to verify only my boarding pass? Multiple times? I'd be very interested to see these procedures in writing." The cabin had fallen completely silent. Even the ambient noise of the aircraft seemed to have dimmed as all attention focused on the confrontation. Captain Peterson turned to Karen, his expression now stern but directed at her rather than Zara. "We'll discuss this later," he said quietly before addressing Zara again. "Special Agent Mitchell, please accept my apologies on behalf of the airline. You are, of course, welcome to remain in your seat, and will ensure you receive the service you're entitled to for the remainder of the flight." The young passenger continued recording, a smile now playing at the corners of his mouth. Dr. Stevens nodded in satisfaction from his seat, watching as the tables turned in real time. Karen's professional demeanor had completely disintegrated. Her hands trembled slightly as she attempted to regain control of the situation and her narrative. "There's been a terrible misunderstanding," she insisted, her voice pitched higher than before. "I was simply following our verification protocols. It had nothing to do with— I would never—" "Never what, exactly?" Zara asked, her voice calm but pointed. "Never question a passenger's right to be in first class based on their appearance? Because that's precisely what you did." Karen's eyes darted around the cabin, seeking support but finding none. Even Michael had taken a small step away from her, creating physical distance from the situation. "I treat all passengers equally," Karen protested. "This was about security and proper procedure, not what you're implying." "Interesting that these security procedures only applied to me," Zara observed. "I'm the only passenger whose boarding pass you checked multiple times, the only one questioned about how I paid for my ticket, the only one you attempted to remove from first class, and, coincidentally, I appear to be the only black passenger in this cabin." The word black seemed to hang in the air. Several white passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some looking away as if the explicit naming of race made the situation more uncomfortable than the actual discrimination they had witnessed. That's not fair," Karen stammered. "I didn't even notice. I don't see color. I treat everyone the same." The claim was so patently untrue that even Captain Peterson couldn't maintain his neutral expression, a slight grimace breaking through his professional facade. Dr. Stevens chose this moment to intervene again. "If I may," he said, his authoritative voice cutting through the tension. "I've been observing this situation from the moment boarding began. This officer was clearly singled out for differential treatment. I watched as she was skipped during the welcome champagne service. I noticed when her requests were ignored. I witnessed the repeated questioning of her right to be here, questioning that was not applied to any other passenger, including myself." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "I spent 42 years as a federal judge, specializing in civil rights cases. What I witnessed today was textbook discriminatory treatment. Karen's face, already pale, now took on an ashen quality. "A judge," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "Federal Judge William Stevens, retired from the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals," he confirmed. "And while I may be retired, I still recognize discrimination when I see it." The revelation of Dr. Stevens' identity added another layer of gravitas to the situation. Captain Peterson's expression had grown increasingly concerned as he recognized the potential legal and public relations disaster unfolding in his first-class cabin. Karen looked desperately toward Michael, seeking some kind of lifeline, but found only professional distance in his expression. "She skipped her during the pre-flight drinks," said a voice from Seat 4B, a middle-aged white man in a business suit who had previously seemed absorbed in his laptop. "I noticed it, but didn't say anything. I should have." His comment broke the dam. Suddenly, other passengers began to speak up. "I heard her muttering to another flight attendant about people not knowing their place," added a woman in Seat 2C. "I thought it was just airline jargon, but now it's clear what she meant." "She checked my boarding pass with a smile," offered an Asian executive from the center section. But when Agent Mitchell presented hers, suddenly there were concerns about verification. The double standard was obvious. Karen's head swiveled from speaker to speaker, her expression increasingly desperate as the chorus of witnesses grew. What she had likely assumed would be a routine exercise of her power, one she had perhaps performed many times before without consequence, was now being documented and corroborated by multiple sources. "I have the whole thing on video," the young man in 4C announced, holding up his phone. "Started recording when I saw how she was being treated. Already sent it to my cloud storage." Zara maintained her composure, though she felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was validation in hearing others acknowledge what she had experienced, but also a familiar weariness. Why had these passengers remained silent until her professional status was revealed? Would they have spoken up if she were simply a black woman without a federal badge? Captain Peterson cleared his throat, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. "I think we've established that there was an unfortunate miscommunication here. Special Agent Mitchell, you have our sincere apologies. Karen, we'll discuss this incident in detail once we reach Atlanta. For now, I believe we should proceed with our departure. We're already behind schedule." It was a transparent attempt to move past the confrontation without addressing its root causes, to relegate it to an unfortunate miscommunication, rather than acknowledge the systemic bias it represented. "This wasn't a miscommunication," Zara stated firmly. "This was discriminatory treatment, and it needs to be acknowledged as such." Dr. Stevens nodded in agreement. Calling discrimination a miscommunication minimizes the harm it causes and perpetuates the conditions that allow it to continue. Other passengers murmured in agreement. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted dramatically, from uncomfortable witnesses to active participants demanding accountability. Karen stood rigid, her professional mask completely shattered. She looked like someone watching her career and reputation disintegrate before her eyes. Michael stepped forward. "Captain, I believe we should consider having another flight attendant take over first-class service for this flight." Captain Peterson surveyed the first-class cabin. What had begun as a routine flight was now a potential public relations nightmare, with multiple witnesses, video evidence, and a federal agent who had been subjected to discriminatory treatment. His priority had shifted from on-time departure to damage control. "Karen," he said, his voice firm but low, "I want you off this flight." The instruction was delivered quietly, but in the tense silence of the cabin, it carried to every passenger. Karen's eyes widened in shock. "James," she protested, using the captain's first name in a breach of professional protocol that revealed their long-standing relationship. "We've worked together for 15 years. You can't just—" "15 years," Captain Peterson interrupted, "which is why I'm deeply disappointed. Lisa will take over your duties in first class." His tone left no room for argument. "Report to HR immediately upon landing in Atlanta." Karen's professional composure completely crumbled. "But I have mortgage payments. This wasn't— I didn't mean—" She looked around desperately, seeking support from colleagues or passengers, finding none. "It was a misunderstanding. I can't lose my job over a misunderstanding." "This goes beyond a misunderstanding," Captain Peterson replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. "We'll discuss this further in Atlanta. For now, I need you to leave the aircraft." The directive was unprecedented. Removing a flight attendant after boarding was complete, especially one with Karen's seniority. It spoke to the severity with which the captain now viewed the situation. Michael stepped forward. "I'll escort Karen to the gate and arrange for a replacement to join us for the flight." Karen stood frozen, the reality of her situation seemingly too overwhelming to process. "This is my route," she whispered. "I've worked first class on this route for 10 years. "And you've just demonstrated why that needs to change," Captain Peterson replied. "Michael, please ensure that Karen is off this aircraft within the next 5 minutes. "Lisa," he called to the other flight attendant who had been watching from near the galley, "you'll be taking over first class for this flight." Lisa nodded, her expression professional but her eyes wide with the unexpected turn of events. Karen looked at Zara, a complex mixture of emotions crossing her face. Anger, fear, and something like bewilderment, as if she genuinely couldn't comprehend how her actions had led to this outcome. Captain Peterson turned to address the first-class cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay and for what has transpired. We'll be departing shortly, and I assure you that American Airlines does not condone the behavior you've witnessed today." Karen's removal from the aircraft unfolded like a slow-motion car crash. Painful to watch, yet impossible to look away from. Her professional identity, which she had worn like armor for 20 years, was being stripped away in front of an audience of first-class passengers and colleagues. "This isn't fair," she protested, her voice rising as Michael gently but firmly guided her toward the front of the aircraft. "I was doing my job, maintaining standards. You can't just throw away 20 years of service over one misunderstanding." Michael kept his voice low, trying to minimize the spectacle. "Karen, please, let's discuss this off the aircraft." But Karen had moved beyond the point of discretion. As they passed Zara's seat, she paused, turning to face the FBI agent with tears of frustration brimming in her eyes. "I hope you're satisfied," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I have bills to pay, a mortgage. It was an honest mistake. Anyone could have made it." Zara met her gaze steadily. "What mistake exactly? Assuming I didn't belong in first class because of how I look? That's not a mistake, Ms. Williams. That's a choice. One you made repeatedly throughout our interaction." Karen's face flushed. "That's not... I didn't..." She struggled to formulate a defense that wouldn't further incriminate her. "I treat everyone the same. The evidence suggests otherwise," Zara replied calmly. Dr. Stevens spoke up from his seat. "Young lady," he addressed Karen, his tone carrying the weight of decades on the federal bench. "When confronted with wrongdoing, the path to redemption begins with acknowledgement, not denial." Karen stared at him, momentarily speechless before turning back to Zara. "I'm sorry if you felt mistreated," she offered, the classic non-apology that placed the burden on the recipient's perception rather than the offender's actions. Zara did not respond, recognizing the hollow nature of the apology. As Michael again attempted to guide Karen toward the exit, she made one last desperate appeal to the cabin at large. "I've served some of you for years. You know me. Tell them this isn't who I am." Her plea was met with uncomfortable silence. Even passengers who had been regular customers on her route avoided eye contact, suddenly fascinated by their phones or the safety cards in their seat pockets. The young man with the phone had stopped recording but watched the scene with undisguised satisfaction. "Justice in real time," he murmured to his seatmate. At the aircraft door, Karen made a final stand. "I'll file a union grievance," she threatened loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. "This is procedurally improper. You can't remove me from an active duty assignment without cause." "We have cause," Michael replied quietly but firmly. "Multiple witnesses and video evidence. Please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." Finally, with shoulders slumped in defeat, Karen allowed herself to be escorted from the aircraft. The forward door closed behind her with a definitive thunk, marking the end of her 20-year career in a way she could never have anticipated at the start of her shift. In the cabin, a palpable release of tension followed her departure. Passengers who had been holding their breath collectively exhaled, quiet conversations resumed. Lisa appeared from the galley, her expression professionally composed despite the extraordinary circumstances she was stepping into. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced to the first-class cabin, "I'll be taking over your service for this flight to Atlanta. We should be departing shortly. Thank you for your patience during this delay." She approached Zara first, a deliberate choice that wasn't lost on the other passengers. "Special Agent Mitchell, would you care for champagne before takeoff?" The simple question, the normal, respectful service that should have been offered from the beginning, highlighted the abnormality of Karen's earlier behavior. Zara nodded. "Yes, thank you. That would be nice." The aircraft pushed back from the gate 15 minutes behind schedule. As the safety demonstration began, Lisa moved through the first-class cabin with a renewed emphasis on attentive, equitable service. She served Zara first, a small gesture of rebalancing that didn't go unnoticed by the other passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Peterson's voice came over the intercom. "This is your captain speaking. I want to apologize once more for our delayed departure. We're currently third in line for takeoff and should be airborne in approximately 10 minutes. Flight time to Atlanta remains at 2 hours and 20 minutes. The weather in Atlanta is clear with temperatures in the mid-70s. On behalf of American Airlines and our crew, I thank you for your patience today." The subtle acknowledgement of the incident, framed as a delayed departure rather than a confrontation about racial bias, was typical of how corporations often managed such situations, acknowledging the disruption while avoiding explicit mention of its cause. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Dr. Stevens unbuckled his seatbelt and turned to face Zara fully. "Special Agent Mitchell," he said, extending his hand. "William Stevens. I apologize for not intervening sooner." Zara accepted the handshake. "No apology necessary, sir. Most people don't get involved at all." "That's precisely the problem," he replied with a rueful smile. "Too many of us remain silent witnesses." His expression turned more serious. "In my 42 years on the federal bench, I saw many cases of discrimination, but few as blatant as what you experienced today. Your composure was commendable." The taxiing process paused as they waited their turn in the departure queue, allowing their conversation to continue. "Training," Zara explained simply. "FBI agents learn to stay calm under pressure." "It's more than training," Dr. Stevens observed. "It's character." He glanced around the cabin. "And it likely wasn't your first experience with such treatment." Zara offered a small, knowing smile that confirmed his assessment without requiring her to elaborate. Both understood the unspoken reality. For Black professionals, such interactions were rarely isolated incidents. Dr. Stevens settled back in his seat as the aircraft began moving forward again. "We'll have time to talk more once we're airborne. I believe we both have stories to share." At cruising altitude, with the seatbelt sign-off and lunch service concluded, the first-class cabin settled into a comfortable rhythm. Lisa had provided impeccable service to all passengers, with a particularly attentive touch for Zara. Not special treatment, but the normal consideration that should have been standard. Dr. Stevens, having finished his meal, turned again toward Zara. "May I join you for a moment?" he asked, gesturing to the empty seat beside her. "I think we have much to discuss." Zara nodded, and the elderly judge moved to the adjacent seat. Up close, the lines of experience on his face were more evident, but his blue eyes remained sharp and perceptive. "What happened today," he began, keeping his voice low enough to maintain privacy, "is exactly the kind of case I studied throughout my career. I specialized in discrimination law, particularly cases involving public accommodations and services." "That explains why you recognized what was happening," Zara observed. Dr. Stevens nodded. "Pattern recognition. After 4 decades, you develop an eye for it." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "What concerns me is how routine it seemed for her. This wasn't a flight attendant having a bad day. This was practiced behavior." "Practiced and perfected," Zara agreed. She knew exactly how to frame her actions in terms of procedures and verification to make her bias seem legitimate. That kind of skillful discrimination is often the most difficult to address because it's disguised as policy enforcement. "Precisely," the judge said, a note of respect in his voice for her analysis. And had you been anyone other than an FBI agent, had you been a doctor, lawyer, business executive, or simply a citizen who saved up for a first-class ticket, the outcome might have been very different. The observation hung between them, a stark acknowledgement of the reality many black professionals faced, the constant need to present credentials to justify their presence in spaces where their white counterparts were presumed to belong. Your badge changed the power dynamic, Dr. Stevens continued, but it shouldn't have been necessary. Basic dignity and respect shouldn't require federal credentials. Zara nodded, appreciating his understanding. The badge made it harder for them to dismiss me, but it doesn't protect me from the initial assumption that I don't belong. And that, Dr. Stevens said, is what makes cases like this so important. They reveal the gap between our aspirational equality and our lived reality. He glanced around the cabin. What strikes me is how many passengers noticed the differential treatment but said nothing until you revealed your position. Silent observation without intervention perpetuates these systems. It's easier to stay silent, Zara acknowledged. Speaking up carries risk. Indeed it does, the judge agreed. Which is why moments like this, when people do finally speak up, matter so profoundly. They create possibilities for systemic change. Unknown to Zara and the other passengers, events were already unfolding beyond the confines of the aircraft. The young man in seat 4C, Kevin Zhao, a 26-year-old software developer with a substantial social media following, had uploaded a 2-minute clip of the confrontation to Twitter before the plane even reached cruising altitude, using the aircraft's Wi-Fi. His caption was simple but effective. FBI agent reveals badge after racist flight attendant tries to kick her out of first class for not belonging. FBI Karen. American Airlines. By the time the flight reached the halfway point to Atlanta, the video had accumulated over 50,000 views and was being shared across multiple platforms. Users were screenshotting Karen's expression of shock when Zara revealed her badge, creating memes that spread even faster than the original video. Comments flooded in. The moment she flashed that badge, priceless. Another day, another Karen policing where black people are allowed to be. Watch how fast her attitude changed when she realized who she was messing with. This is why representation matters. Imagine if she wasn't an FBI agent. Would anyone have stood up for her? American Airlines better address this. I'm canceling my flights with them until they do. The hashtag #FBI Karen was trending in multiple cities, and media outlets were beginning to pick up the story. Several journalists were already reaching out to American Airlines' corporate communications department for comment. Within the cocoon of the aircraft, the passengers remained unaware of the digital firestorm brewing. Kevin occasionally checked his phone, a small smile playing at his lips as he witnessed the exponential growth of his post's engagement. Lisa, serving coffee in the first-class cabin, had no idea that her colleague was already becoming an internet phenomenon, a symbol of the everyday discrimination that often went unchallenged. Karen, likely still at the airport awaiting a staff flight back to Atlanta, couldn't know that her face was being shared thousands of times per minute, her actions scrutinized and condemned by strangers across the country. The digital response was moving faster than the aircraft itself, creating a reception committee of public opinion that would be waiting when they landed. The aircraft's touchdown at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport was smooth and unremarkable. As passengers gathered their belongings and prepared to disembark, there was no indication that anything extraordinary awaited them. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Peterson announced, "welcome to Atlanta. Local time is 4:45 p.m., and the temperature is 76 degrees. On behalf of American Airlines and our Atlanta-based crew, I'd like to thank you for flying with us today." The standard announcement made no reference to the earlier confrontation, another example of how institutions often preferred to minimize rather than acknowledge incidents of discrimination. As first-class passengers began to file toward the exit, several paused briefly by Zara's seat. "Thank you for your composure back there," said a middle-aged executive who had been sitting across the aisle. It was a lesson in dignity. Others offered similar comments, brief acknowledgments of what they had witnessed and perhaps their own silent complicity in similar situations they had observed in the past. Dr. Stevens was the last to leave from their section. "Special Agent Mitchell," he said, handing her a business card. "I'd be honored to continue our conversation sometime. What happened today deserves to be part of a larger discussion about institutional change." Zara accepted the card with a nod of appreciation. "I'd like that, Your Honor." As she finally made her way to the jet bridge, Zara was surprised to see a small gathering of passengers waiting at the gate area. When they spotted her, several approached. A young black woman in her early 20s stepped forward. "Are you the FBI agent from the video? The one who stood up to that flight attendant?" Zara blinked in confusion. "Video?" The woman held up her phone, displaying Kevin's viral Twitter post, which had now accumulated over 250,000 views. "You're trending. Can I take a selfie with you? You're my hero today." Uncomfortable with the sudden attention but understanding its significance, Zara nodded. As the young woman positioned herself for the photo, she whispered, "Thank you for showing that we don't have to accept being treated that way." Zara, who had simply been trying to get home after a long operation, found herself unexpectedly cast as a symbol of resistance. "I was just standing my ground," she said. "Anyone deserves to be treated with respect." "That's exactly why it matters," the young woman replied. "You showed that we can demand the respect we deserve." 1 week after the incident, American Airlines released an official statement. American Airlines is committed to creating a safe, comfortable environment for all passengers, regardless of race, gender, religion, or background. A recent incident on Flight AA1372 from New York to Atlanta fell significantly short of our standards. Following a thorough internal investigation, we have taken appropriate action, including the termination of the flight attendant involved. Additionally, American Airlines is implementing enhanced anti-discrimination training for all customer-facing employees. This comprehensive program will address implicit bias and provide tools for creating an inclusive environment for all passengers. We have extended our sincere apologies to the passenger affected by this incident, along with an offer of compensation that includes concierge key status and flight credits as a gesture of our commitment to doing better. American Airlines remains dedicated to learning from this experience and ensuring that all passengers are treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. The corporate response came after days of mounting pressure. The video of the confrontation had been viewed over 3 million times across multiple platforms. Major news outlets had picked up the story, running headlines like "Badge of Honor," "FBI Agent Exposes First-Class Discrimination," and "American Airlines Flight Attendant Fired After Viral Discrimination Video." For Zara, the aftermath had been overwhelming. Her phone had lit up with messages from friends and colleagues who recognized her in the video. Her FBI supervisor had been supportive, but reminded her about media protocols. Agents weren't supposed to become viral sensations. The airline's offer of concierge key status, their invitation-only program typically reserved for passengers who flew over 50,000 miles and spent tens of thousands on tickets annually, and flight credits was substantial. But Zara found herself ambivalent about the compensation. It felt somehow inadequate, addressing her individual experience while potentially leaving the systemic issues unresolved. She was more encouraged by the announced training program, though experience had taught her that corporate diversity initiatives often generated more press releases than actual change. Still, public accountability created possibilities for meaningful improvement. Meanwhile, Karen Williams had become an unwilling case study in consequences. Her name and image had been widely circulated, her 2-decade career reduced to a 2-minute video that would likely follow her through any future job applications. Some viewed this as appropriate accountability. Others saw it as disproportionate punishment for behavior that had long been tacitly permitted by the airline industry. What was clear was that the rapid spread of the video had transformed what might once have been a private indignity into a public reckoning. 3 months after the incident, Zara found herself sitting in a conference room at the federal courthouse in Atlanta. Across the table sat Karen Williams, flanked by her attorney and a representative from the Flight Attendants Union. Also present were American Airlines legal counsel, Dr. William Stevens as a witness, and the court-appointed mediator. The airline had filed a civil action against Karen for violating their non-discrimination policies and damaging their brand, seeking to recover costs associated with the public relations crisis that followed the incident. Karen had countered with a wrongful termination suit, claiming she was made a scapegoat for systemic issues. Zara had been called as a witness but had declined to file her own lawsuit. Her presence today was purely to provide testimony about her experience. Karen looked markedly different from the confident flight attendant who had attempted to remove Zara from first class. The strain of the past months showed in the new lines around her eyes and the tension in her shoulders. When she spoke, her voice carried the weariness of someone who had lost not just a job but an identity. "I made a terrible mistake," Karen acknowledged during her statement, tears welling in her eyes. "I never meant, I didn't realize." She struggled to articulate a defense that wouldn't further incriminate her. "I'm not a racist person. I've served thousands of passengers of all backgrounds." Her attorney interjected, "Ms. Williams had an exemplary record for 20 years. This single incident, while regrettable, should not define her entire career." The airline's zero-tolerance response fails to account for her long service and denies her the opportunity for correction and growth. Zara listened without visible reaction, though internally she noted the familiar pattern. Consequences characterized as excessive, the harm minimized as a single incident. The emphasis on the perpetrator's distress rather than the target's experience. When it was her turn to speak, Zara chose her words carefully. "I'm not here seeking retribution against Ms. Williams," she began. "What happened that day was not about one person, but about patterns of behavior that go unchallenged because they're normalized within systems." She turned to address Karen directly. "I don't believe you woke up that morning intending to discriminate against a black passenger. I believe you acted on assumptions that have been reinforced throughout your life and career, assumptions about who belongs in first class and who doesn't. The problem isn't just individual bias, it's the systems that permit that bias to determine how people are treated." Dr. Stevens nodded in agreement, his expression somber. "I'm not interested in seeing Ms. Williams punished," Zara continued. "I'm interested in accountability that leads to meaningful change. If this incident becomes merely about one bad employee, rather than examining the culture that enabled her behavior, then we've missed the opportunity for real transformation." Karen stared at Zara, seemingly stunned by the absence of vindictiveness in her statement. The mediator nodded. "Thank you, Special Agent Mitchell. That's a perspective we need to consider as we work toward resolution." 6 months after the incident, Zara stood at the podium in a conference room at American Airlines corporate headquarters in Fort Worth, Texas. Before her sat 30 flight attendants, pilots, and customer service representatives, the first cohort of the airline's new Excellence in Inclusive Service training program. On the screen behind her was a still image from the viral video. Frozen at the moment Karen had asked Zara to move to economy. It was a powerful visual, one that still made Zara slightly uncomfortable to see. "This incident isn't about a bad employee," Zara explained, echoing the sentiment she had expressed during mediation. "It's about recognizing patterns of behavior that can affect any of us and developing the awareness and tools to counteract them." In an unexpected turn of events, American Airlines had invited Zara to help develop and lead their anti-discrimination training. After consulting with her FBI supervisors and receiving approval, with strict guidelines about not discussing operational details, she had agreed. Dr. Stevens had also joined the project as a consultant, bringing his legal expertise and judicial perspective. The question we're exploring today isn't, how do we avoid getting caught discriminating? Zara continued. It's, how do we create systems where equal treatment is the default, not the exception? The training focused not just on avoiding negative behaviors, but on actively cultivating inclusive practices. It included role-playing scenarios, analysis of real-world incidents, including Zara's, and practical strategies for recognizing and countering implicit bias. What had begun as a humiliating experience had transformed into an opportunity for systemic change. While Zara harbored no illusions about the challenges of institutional transformation, the engagement of the participants gave her hope that meaningful improvement was possible. Change happens at multiple levels, she told the attentive audience. Individual awareness matters. Bystander intervention matters. Institutional policies matter. But most of all, consistent practice matters. Excellence in service means excellence for everyone, without exception. The final slide of her presentation showed the incident from a different angle. Not just a confrontation between a passenger and flight attendant, but a moment that had created ripples throughout an entire industry. This isn't about punishment or blame, Zara concluded. It's about learning, growth, and transformation. It's about ensuring that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. 1 year later, Zara boarded another first-class flight from New York to Atlanta. The frequency of her work trips hadn't changed, but her experience as a passenger had. The viral moment had made her recognizable to many airline staff, creating an awkward celebrity she hadn't sought. As she settled into her seat, a flight attendant approached, a young black woman whose name tag read Jasmine. "Special Agent Mitchell," Jasmine said quietly, "I just wanted to say thank you. I was in the second training cohort of the program you helped develop. It's changed our airline completely. How we think about service, how we talk about passengers, even how we structure our systems." Zara smiled, genuinely touched. "That's good to hear." "It's more than good," Jasmine continued. "It's transformative. What happened to you was terrible, but what came from it has made things better for so many people, both passengers and crew." As the flight prepared for departure, Zara felt something she hadn't experienced on an airplane in a long time: the simple pleasure of being treated with the same respect and consideration as everyone else. Not because of her badge or her viral fame, but because it was the standard of service that everyone deserved. It wasn't perfect, systemic change never was, but it was progress. And for now, that was enough.